Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Neurotrition Podcast, where we give you the tools to balance the brain, optimize the body, and redefine how to unlock human potential. Today, we're going to be discussing the journey of perimenopause. Today, I want to explain what's really happening in perimenopause, why the symptoms many women experience are more than just how these hormones decrease and change.
The Neurotrition Podcast is sponsored by North Florida Spine and Wellness and produced by Juming Delmas Studios.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Neurotrition Podcast, where we give you the tools to balance the brain, optimize the body, and redefine how to unlock human potential. I'm your host, Dr. Z, and today we're going to be discussing the journey of perimenopause. This is a transition that all women go through, and for the typical patient who comes into my office, they have symptoms that vary from everything to brain fog, fatigue, mood dysregulation, to drops in libido, sleep disturbances, and your traditional symptoms like hot flashes. But these symptoms just aren't all dropping hormones. It's really a brain-body communication system breaking rhythm during this transition. Today, I want to explain what's really happening in perimenopause, why the symptoms many women experience are more than just how these hormones decrease and change. It's actually about the brain, adrenal and thyroid function, hormone metabolism, and of course, some genetics. So let me begin by just telling you the story about a typical perimenopausal patient. Let's just say her name is Sarah. Sarah, when she came into the office, she didn't come in complaining of hot flashes like most people would expect. She actually started with feelings of anxiety. She was very tired. She had trouble getting through the day. She wasn't sleeping as well. She either felt very physically tired and went down to lay to bed and, her brain was wired. She was wide awake. And when she did fall asleep, she oftentimes would wake up between 2 and 3 in the morning and not be able to get back into bed for maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours. Some nights she wouldn't be able to do it at all. And this is really where women get confused because they feel like they're just stressed, even though in Sarah's case, she did not necessarily feel like she had more stress in her life. In fact, her stress had gone down at her work and other stressors related to life in general, but she definitely was feeling more anxious. She was feeling like she wasn't handling that stress as well as she should. And that's because the first thing that happens when women go into perimenopause is that there's a hormone signaling problem in the brain itself. And that's really important to understand, that the brain has a lot of control over what our endocrine system does. So it helps modulate the thyroid, it helps modulate the adrenal glands. It helps send signals to the ovaries to produce estrogen. So this will also end up affecting neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, GABA. And of course, when the neurotransmitters are affected, that's when we can have symptoms of mood swings, anxiety, depression, all of these other things, because there's basically a dysregulation coming from the hypothalamus and the pituitary and even the cerebellum in our vestibular system, which we typically just think of, balance and coordination. But those symptoms start to get dysregulated. So let's start off with some of the vestibular dysfunction. So when we looked at Sarah, our first thing was to evaluate her. I do this with every patient, is do a good neurological based exam. So she did say she was starting to feel dizzy. Maybe she got a little bit of motion sickness when her and her husband would go out on the boat. She started to feel like she was starting to feel dysregulated, maybe even a little bit nauseous when she hadn't really had that in the past. She started feeling random anxiety in places where she wasn't expected to have that anxiety. So one example she gave was just randomly standing in the line in Target, and she nearly had a full-blown anxiety attack. So we want to know why these symptoms are happening, okay? And like I said, the vestibular system is a good place to start. So we will do some testing. We did some testing with Sarah. One of the tests we do, which is my favorite and most fun test, everyone likes doing this test, is called Fukuda test. And so we'll have them with their arms out in front of them. They'll march in place with their eyes closed. And what should happen with a good regulated vestibular system, which helps your body know where you are in space, that spatial awareness. It also helps our brains kind of regulate and know that the world is level, okay? And when there's dysregulation in that system, the body has to adjust, and that can come with head tilts and eye movement changes. They're going to help regulate that system so the world can remain level. So when she did this test, again, you're out with your arms in front, marching in place. And what should happen is with your eyes closed, you should be able to stay relatively straight and in place. Well, for her, she actually turned about 90 degrees to the right, okay, through that test. So that told me off the bat that her vestibular system is dysregulated. So what does this have to do with hormones? Well, like I already mentioned, there's a lot of parts of the brain that have estrogen receptors in the brain itself. And when there is a drop in estrogen or fluctuations in estrogen and other hormones, then we can start to have decreased input to these neurological symptoms. And especially if and this is very common for a lot of folks, is that they already have a weakness in one of those systems. And when you have this changes in hormones, those weaknesses now become more profound. So with the wiring of the nervous system, it also communicates to the hypothalamus, to the pituitary, to help create signals downstream back to the endocrine system itself. So whether it starts in the brain or starts with the dropping and fluctuating hormones, you can say it probably goes both directions. But that also means that it's very, very important to not only recognize that deficiency in the nervous system, but to be able to treat it and regulate it to get the best response possible. So how does this then play into anxiety? Well, let's take Sarah with having these anxiety issues that she started to experience. When your body does not feel regulated from a sense of knowing where you are at space, one of the things that gets triggered in your brainstem and in your oblongata is the fight and flight response. As it's kind of the feeling of if you imagine you're about to fall over or you feel a little dizzy, to try to keep yourself upright, your body initiates that fight and flight response so other systems can then compensate for that feeling. So the more her fight and flight response gets stimulated due to these imbalances in the vestibular system, we then start creating this negative feedback loop, okay? So we're underregulated in the vestibular system. Our body doesn't know where it is in space. And then for Sarah, it starts to become this chronic fight and flight stimulation that then can start to release cortisol. That's going to start to fatigue her adrenal glands, okay, being able to regulate that normal stress response. And as that happens over a period of time, that negative feedback loop gets stronger and stronger until it spills over into symptoms like anxiety and even maybe depression. And this is a very common thing that a lot of women will experience, and they'll start to get a kind of a haze, which they often describe as brain fog. So for her, the next step was to test some heart rate variability, measure. And, I think there's some better ways than others to measure heart rate variability. In our situation, we really like to use heart rate variability in the context of how it regulates under stress. So that's when we'll have someone go from laying to standing so we can see how that system regulates upon what we refer to as a normal stressor, because just going from laying to standing should trigger a little bit of fight and flight response. With Sarah, what was interesting is when she went from laying to standing, not only did her fight and flight overreact, but the other system, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system that frankly just keeps us young, allows us to sleep and allows us to regenerate. Under that normal stressor, her sympathetic overreacted and her parasympathetic overreacted. And that is commonly that's a common pattern we see when the vagus nerve, which regulates that gut-brain pathway, regulates the parasympathetic system and helps suppress the overstimulation of that fight and flight, comes into play. So now we're already starting to get a picture of Sarah where her vestibular system's dysregulated. We know that she is not able to regulate her fight and flight response very well. So now we're seeing some very good reasons why she's having brain fog, why she's having anxiety. So now we got to start thinking about, what are we going to do? How are we going to look at her from a perspective of what is her endocrine system actually doing? And my main go-to in these patients is to check her thyroid. And oftentimes, and this was the case with Sarah, that she, comes, well, my doctor's already checked my thyroid. My thyroid's fine. And that's a very common story, probably the most frequent thing that I hear. And it's an unfortunate medical experience because in reality, the thyroid wasn't checked very thoroughly to begin with. Typically, they just measure TSH, they may measure a T4 level, but they don't go into the depths of how the hormones are going to be used at the cellular level. And then plus, they look at them in wide normals that oftentimes people can be outside of those or inside those normals, but they don't feel well. Those levels aren't optimized. The really bad part of this is when these patients go through this and say, oh, your thyroid's normal, you're just getting a little older, you're going through some changes, here's an antidepressant, just kind of something to maybe make their mood feel a little bit better. And it has this negative consequence of essentially the patient starts, and this was the case with Sarah, she started to feel like she was crazy, that it was all in her head, and these symptoms weren't really real. So we're going to check a TSH, we're going to check a free T4, and we're going to check a free T3. Maybe look at some thyroid antibodies as well, because that can slightly change how you address the thyroid function from a functional perspective. But that's kind of the starting point. And the most common thing I see in these perimenopausal women, and this is exactly what was happening with Sarah, her TSH was perfect, maybe even a little more on the low side. And when TSH, thyroid function get a little confusing, but when TSH is low, that means your thyroid is more likely to be overactive, not underactive. And even though she had this lower TSH, her T4 looked beautiful, it was right in the middle of the optimal levels. Her free T3 was very low, okay? Actually right on the edge of being even low from the medical standard. And when that happens, that means there's a problem with thyroid hormone conversion. So T4 is not getting converted to T3. And that's really important because the cells are what T3 actually goes to and is where it's utilized. So if you're not having normal T3, you're essentially going to feel like you have hypothyroidism. And that was the case with Sarah. So it was really important to pick that up. Now, of course, we want to look at hormones. That's a very important thing. However, I sometimes don't do this off the bat. I might do them to kind of get a baseline of where they're at. So we'll measure estradiol, which is also referred to as E2. It's what I quote the young estrogen. We'll look at progesterone. We might look at FSH and LH. That's the hormone signaling from the brain. And then, of course, and I think this is, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but the most underrated hormone when it comes to women, and it's testosterone. And it's really important to get that free testosterone level. And so when we did that, we did see with her, there was some low hormone functions. Her estrogen was starting to get a little bit low. Her progesterone was starting to get a little bit low. And Sarah was someone who had, like I said in the beginning, her stress had been mitigated here in the last, maybe year. But before that, she had a very high stress life between work and family. And that had been weighing on her for quite a long time, which was part of her frustration. Here's my stress going down, and I'm actually starting to feel worse. And so knowing that history, knowing these other things we've seen about the nervous system, it starts making sense, because one of the things that blocks the thyroid conversion the most is cortisol. So now we're thinking, not only do we have some low thyroid function, but we probably have some adrenal stress. We probably have some adrenal glands that are not functioning at an optimal level. And when that's happening, it's really important to look at the adrenal glands. The other thing we did was a saliva-based cortisol test that we measured throughout the day. And we saw high cortisol in the morning, high cortisol at night. And interestingly enough, probably about 2 or 3 o'clock, her cortisol just tanked. And that matched more symptoms Sarah was saying. She had, she would feel okay during the day, but many times after lunch, she would just absolutely crash. And that made sense with that big fluctuation in cortisol. And then as it raised back at night, that makes sense why she started to have issues where she felt physically tired, but mentally was wide awake because of that excess cortisol at night. So now we're starting to get the reasons of why she's not sleeping. We're starting to get the reasons of, why we're having these thyroid issues. And going back to testosterone, the testosterone comes from the adrenal glands in women. And when we're having issues with the adrenal glands, and especially in high stress individuals, testosterone levels are something that are going to get impacted quite often. So we also ran a total and free testosterone. And then finally, we saw another test that we run called Sex Hormone Binding Globulin. And that one is really, really important because even if you have normal hormone numbers, if you have a lot of these globulins that will basically connect to the active hormones, then those hormones can't be used by your cells. So knowing if that's a problem is really important. Even if you are considering some hormone replacement down the road, if you have this high sex hormone binding globulin, you're either going to need a lot more of those hormones, which is not always the greatest way to approach that. But you're going to have to free them up. You're going to have to get a way to get more bioavailability of those hormones to the cells. And, that's, again, another thing that impacts that binding globulin is going to be that cortisol response. So the adrenals and thyroid is something I'm going to look at pretty closely in these patients and what we did with Sarah. So that brings us into the actual hormones, okay? But when we talk about hormones, I like to think about them more so in the context of how they're metabolized. Obviously, we want to know what hormones are low, but we also want to know or get an idea of how these hormones are metabolized. So, for instance, for women who have things like polycystic ovarian syndrome, or maybe they have a history of just ovarian cysts or fibroids or endometriosis. Maybe they have a history of estrogen-dependent breast cancer in their family. These are things that are going to tell us that there's probably an issue with hormone metabolism, how those hormones are broken down and utilized, and how they're detoxified after the process is done. And that can be found in pretty good detail. We actually have really good genetic testing. We use that kind of testing in our office often. And there's certain genes like CYP1B1 and COMT, and there's some other ones involved in detoxification that will tell us if this patient is likely to have this issue. And if they have that issue, plus with a history of, like I said, those fibroids and ovarian cysts that are very closely related to excess estrogen and poor estrogen metabolism, then we really know we have to address that, because if you don't, then hormone replacement can have some risks, can give you some risk factor towards estrogen-dependent cancers like cervix cancer and breast cancer. But also, you're not going to feel, even though you may feel some better getting those hormones up, you're not going to feel as good as you could be if you had that proper metabolism. So this was an issue on Sarah's genetic test. She had issues with both the metabolism of estrogen and also the detoxification of estrogen. So we knew we had to take some precautions on that end as well. At the end of the day, what we had with her is we knew we had some dysregulation in her nervous system. We knew her brain was imbalanced. We knew she had this fight and flight response that was not being regulated. So we knew we had to deal with that. So one part of the treatment plan was to do some vestibular rehab, use some red light therapy on her head to help create some wiring and connectivity in those underconnected areas. And then we also had to do some vagus nerve stimulation to help reduce that fight and flight response. And then the next thing was, when we go back to her lab testing, yes, she had this conversion problem in her thyroid. She also had this cortisol imbalance. So that's where we started using adaptogen herbs. Things like ashwagandha is one of the most popular one. I like to use kind of a synergistic blend of adaptogens. I don't necessarily very often like to use them individually. That can work, but I find better results when I use a blend of adaptogen herbs. So we utilize that to help regulate the cortisol response, especially during the day. And when we have those patients who drop, like Sarah, at kind of after lunch in the early afternoon, then we'll often treat her in the morning and around lunchtime with those adaptogens. The next thing we had to do is really work on thyroid conversion. So to do that, the regulating the cortisol was going to be a big part of that. But we also used selenium. Selenium is a great antioxidant nutrient that actually facilitates that T4 to T3 conversion. We also used always use some good bioavailable B vitamins in these cases, and it was really cool to see the progression of her throughout that process. One of the first things she noticed was the brain fog got lifted within a few weeks. She's already started feeling a little bit of energy boost. She started feeling better when she got on her husband's boat. She was able to do that without any symptomatology. Now, as we went through this process, we did kind of get to a point where she started to plateau. We confirmed her thyroid hormones were getting to optimal levels. But her hormones were still kind of in the tank, okay? Progesterone had actually kind of normalized out. We didn't have so much issues there, but we did still have that low testosterone level and low estradiol levels that we were still dealing with. So my recommendation, once women get to that point, and this is what Sarah ended up doing moving forward, was we started doing some hormone replacement, but it was done first via testosterone. That is typically my first recommendation as far as hormone replacement, because when we replace testosterone, there's going to be a chunk of that is aromatized into estrogen. Okay, it's shifted to that E2. So that's a really good way to start with that. But of course, we have to remember, because that testosterone is likely to shift into estrogen, we've got to make sure that estrogen gets metabolized well and gets detoxified. So that's where we used products like DIM to help the metabolism, and then something called calcium D-glucarate, which helps with the detoxification. So as we worked through that started getting us to kind of the next level with her care. Essentially, she got to the point where she didn't need her antidepressants, she didn't need her anxiety medication, her energy had come back. And what's great about that, and I think what's important for listeners to take home from this, is that perimenopause is not something you have to feel bad when you go through, okay? It's not necessary to suffer through this transition, especially when you address it in a holistic, complete mind-body approach to regulate all of those systems involved, because all of these systems work together. And if you're not addressing all of them comprehensively, then oftentimes you might get some improvement, but you're still going to have some things that you struggle to regulate out, and then you just feel like you're just there to suffer through this process. So to recap, essentially what we did with Sarah was to regulate her nervous system, balance out her adrenals and thyroid, and then we had to do some simple hormone replacement. And now she feels better mentally, she feels better physically. And because of her proactiveness and her ability to have someone address this in a comprehensive, holistic fashion, she feels excellent. She's going to go through this transition much more smoothly than she otherwise would have. And she'll likely be much healthier as she gets older. That's going to affect how osteoporosis and osteopenia, thinning of your bones, can progress as she gets older. So there's a lot of significant impacts of dealing with this in a functional mind-body approach. And, one thing I didn't really talk about here, another really essential part of her getting better was lifestyle changes. Not everyone will commit to that process. But, she wasn't, she did some exercise. She really was just doing cardio a few days a week. But once we got her into, increasing some protein intake, changing some of those dietary habits, it wasn't huge changes for her. We started having her do some resistance training as well. I truly believe is very, very impactful, and you're going to get much quicker, better results when you add that in there. So that's it for this episode of the Neurotrition Podcast. I really hope this gives women out there a sense that you do not have to suffer through perimenopause. There are some very good functional approaches that can be used. And I would say, don't wait until you start feeling bad. If you're in your late 30s, if you're in your early 40s and you really feel pretty good, let's start getting on top of this stuff now. Let's see if you already have some of those neurological imbalances that aren't really symptomatic right now, but could become symptomatic as your hormones continue to shift. If we can get ahead of that, then it can be even a smoother process moving forward. So don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. And if you need some help getting through this process, don't hesitate to reach out. You can sign up for a free consultation with me. We'll talk through your case, just like I did Sarah's case here. And we can see if we can find some solution for you. So go to our website at healthytallahassee.com, and I'm happy to help you. And we'll see you on the next episode.